All right, so this week, you guys really wanted us to take a look at, well, some pretty intense global events. And let me tell you, things are not looking too good out there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a whirlwind, isn't it?
We've got, let's see, articles from The Guardian and some AP news pieces, and they're covering pretty much everything. The Israel-Hamas war is still raging, and it seems like everyone's feeling the effects. And then on top of that, the Philippines is bracing for yet another major storm, like it hasn't been through enough already.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how all these things that seem so different are actually like totally intertwined. You start to see the big picture, the geopolitical landscape and how it's all connected.
Totally. And we're going to try to untangle it all for you today, starting with the situation in Gaza. Well, the Guardian's calling it apocalyptic, and their article really paints a grim picture. Apparently, aid deliveries have just plummeted, even after a pretty strong warning from the U.S.
Things have gotten so much worse since May, when we saw that peak in aid going into Gaza. The U.S. actually demanded that Israel step up and increase the flow of humanitarian supplies, even went so far as to threaten sanctions if they didn't comply. But here we are 11 months later, and aid to Gaza is at its lowest point. It's pretty baffling.
It's really scary when you think about the human cost of all this. The Guardian article really highlights that. Food prices are through the roof. Imagine a kilo of tomatoes costing almost $20. People can barely afford basic necessities. There are shortages everywhere, and hunger is just rampant. Even if people have the money, they can't buy food because there's just nothing to buy.
And it makes you wonder, why isn't the U.S., the one who issued the ultimatum, actually doing something about it? They've supposedly ignored reports in the past from their own agencies saying Israel was blocking aid. And get this, that 30-day ultimatum they issued, it's about to expire. So what's going to happen? Will they actually take action this time if Israel keeps restricting aid?
Yeah, it's a messy situation for sure. Israel's claiming they're facing all these logistical challenges while the UN's accusing them of, well, basically being deliberately obstructive, restricting aid on purpose and delaying permits. And then you've got the whole issue of lawlessness and aid looting on top of everything else.
Can you believe it? Almost a third of all the aid that's supposed to be going to the people in Gaza gets stolen, either by gangs or even Hamas. It's awful because it just makes the suffering so much worse for the people who actually need it.
Absolutely. And speaking of things not going as planned, this whole North Korea-Russia situation is a perfect example of how seemingly unconnected events can have global consequences. This isn't just some small agreement they cooked up. We're talking about the largest defense treaty they've signed since the Cold War, and both countries just ratified it.
And the timing of it all, like with the war in Ukraine still raging, it's pretty suspect. The U.S., South Korea, and Ukraine have all said that North Korea has been sending military support to Russia already. Now that this treaty is officially in place, who knows how much that support could increase?
Right. It basically formalizes their alliance, takes it to a whole new level. They're obligated to help each other out militarily if either one gets attacked. And they're talking about working together to create a multipolar world order. Basically, they want to challenge the U.S.'s global dominance. They're even going to collaborate on things like atomic energy and space exploration. Imagine Russia sharing all this sensitive technology with North Korea in exchange for their support. It's a scary thought.
It could definitely signal a big shift away from a world led by the U.S. It's like instead of one major power, we're moving towards a system where several major players are calling the shots. And with North Korea's track record, well, let's just say this development isn't exactly calming anyone's nerves. It's definitely raising a lot of concerns about security in the region and the potential for things to get even more unstable.
Definitely. Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about a different kind of challenge. The Philippines, believe it or not, is about to get hit by their fifth major storm in just 3 weeks. This one's called Tropical Storm Usagi, and they're expecting it to strengthen into a full-blown typhoon before it makes landfall.
Seriously, the resilience of the Filipino people blows my mind. They get hit with an average of 20 major storms every year. That just shows you how vulnerable they are to these natural disasters. And they're still dealing with the aftermath of those 4 other storms, Taraji, Trami, Yingxing, and Kongray, all in the past few weeks.
It's crazy. We're talking about deaths, mass evacuations, infrastructure damage, the whole 9 yards. The government's already started evacuating people from high-risk areas, but it's a logistical nightmare, and their resources are already stretched so thin.
It just goes to show you the kind of challenges that countries on the front lines of climate change are up against. And unfortunately, these storms are only going to get more frequent and more intense. It pushes communities further into poverty and tragically leads to more loss of life.
Absolutely. Now let's head back to the Middle East, where things have taken another interesting turn. Saudi Arabia has stepped up and taken a pretty bold stance against Israel. The Crown Prince himself publicly accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. This isn't just some offhand comment, it's a major escalation coming from a key player in the region.
It's not every day you hear a Saudi official criticizing Israel so openly. It's definitely a sign that things are shifting in the region, and it adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. And he didn't stop there. He also went after Israel for their attacks on Lebanon and Iran, even going as far as to warn them against attacking Iran.
Which, by the way, kind of hints that relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran might be improving. Remember, these two have been rivals for decades, so any kind of reconciliation between them could have huge consequences for the region and the world, really. It could affect everything from oil prices to the conflicts in Syria and Yemen.
For sure. To really understand how serious this is, we need to rewind a bit and look at how this war started. It all goes back to October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched that attack on southern Israel. Tragically, around 1,200 people, most of them civilians, were killed, and 251 were taken hostage.
And Israel retaliated hard and fast. Their military campaign, which aims to wipe out Hamas, has already led to over 43,400 deaths in Gaza, according to the Hamas-run health ministry.
It's not just the sheer number of casualties that's alarming. It's the fact that so many of them are women and children. The UN Human Rights Office has reported that a disproportionate number of those killed and injured are women and children. It raises serious concerns about whether Israel's response is justified and if they're potentially violating international law.
Yeah, and then to make things even worse, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has banned UNRWA from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem. UNRWA is the UN agency that's dedicated to helping Palestinian refugees, and Israel's accusing them of working with Hamas.
This ban has a lot of people worried, including the US and the UK. They're concerned that it'll make it even harder to get aid into Gaza, which is already a humanitarian disaster.
And as if things weren't complicated enough, Donald Trump's back in the White House, which adds another layer of uncertainty.
Trump's return has gotten mixed reactions in the Middle East. Some people see it as a good thing, pointing to his role in the Abraham Accords, which, help normalize relations between Israel and some Arab countries.
Others are a little more cautious, though, bringing up things like his decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and his close relationship with the Israeli government. It's still too early to say what impact his presidency will have on this whole situation between Israel and Hamas, or the wider Middle East for that matter, but it's definitely something that's going to shape the future of the region.
It's easy to get caught up in all the politics and military stuff, but it's important to remember the human cost of all of this. The families that have been ripped apart, the lives that have been lost, the futures that have been completely changed. It's a powerful reminder that we need to find a way to achieve peace and understanding.
And speaking of the human cost, that's what really struck me about the AP News article we have. It focuses on the impact of all this on the children in Lebanon, the kids who are bearing the brunt of this conflict in ways we can't even imagine.
The article starts with this really heartbreaking story about a 4-year-old boy named Hussein Mikdad. He's the only one left in his immediate family after an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. His mom, his 3 siblings, and 6 other relatives were all killed. Can you imagine what that must be like for him? This tiny little boy who lost everything in an instant.
It's just devastating. The article talks about his physical injuries, like a fractured thigh and torn tendons, but it's the emotional trauma that's the most worrisome. He's regressed, he needs diapers again, he wets the bed, he barely speaks. He's just struggling to cope with losing his entire family.
And his story is just one of many. The article says that hundreds of Lebanese children have been hurt physically and emotionally because of this war. They have these statistics about child casualties and injuries that just paint such a grim picture of what this is doing to the youngest generation.
And it's not just the immediate danger they're facing, it's the long-term effects of all this trauma. The article quotes some experts who are worried about the lasting consequences of living through something so horrific. Anxiety, nightmares, trouble concentrating, and a constant fear that could stay with them for years to come.
These kids have seen things that no child should ever have to see. Explosions, destruction, losing their loved ones. These experiences leave such a deep mark on their young minds. It's a reminder that while we focus on the political and military side of things, It's the human cost that really matters.
Absolutely. And the AP article does a great job of bringing these experiences to life. They use stories and quotes from the children themselves, describing what it's like to live in these overcrowded shelters, trying to deal with the loss of their homes, their routines, their sense of normalcy. It's just this incredibly poignant picture of innocence lost and childhoods shattered by war.
It's like these kids are carrying the weight of this whole conflict on their tiny shoulders, and the scars they have, the ones you can see and the ones you can't, are a constant reminder of just how devastating war is.
It's so easy to get lost in the headlines and all the geopolitical analysis, but it's so important to remember that behind every statistic, every policy decision, there are real people whose lives are being changed forever. And in this case, it's the children who are paying the highest price.
For sure.
Yep.
When we talk about things being interconnected, this whole aid crisis in Gaza, it's a prime example. It's easy to get bogged down in all the numbers and the political back and forth between Israel and the U.S., but we got to remember there are actual people caught in the middle of all this. Their lives are literally on the line.
Yeah, the Guardian article does a really good job of bringing that human element to the forefront. They describe what it's actually like in Gaza right now. There's hardly any food, the prices are insane, and families are just desperate. They're struggling to feed their kids. It's a completely different picture from what we saw back in May when there was that surge of aid going in.
Yeah, total 180. Back then, there was at least some hope that things would improve, but now, people are running out of the essentials, medicine, clean water, fuel, you name it. It's a full-blown humanitarian crisis, and it's unfolding right in front of us.
And the article dives into all the complications surrounding how this aid is supposed to be delivered. You've got accusations that Israel's deliberately making it difficult, and then you have all the logistical obstacles that aid organizations are facing, trying to operate in such a dangerous and unstable environment.
It's a blame game, that's for sure. Israel's pointing fingers at Hamas, talking about logistical issues, while the UN is basically accusing them of putting up roadblocks on purpose, delaying permits, and just generally making it as hard as possible for aid to get through. And then you throw in the problem of aid theft, and it just makes the whole thing even more messed up.
It's hard to believe that so much of the aid that's supposed to be helping people is actually being stolen. Criminal gangs, Hamas, whoever it is, they're taking advantage of a horrible situation and making it worse. It really shows you how fragile things are in Gaza and how difficult it is to ensure that the aid is actually reaching the people who need it most.
And then you have the U.S., they're like the big player in all this, right? They issued that ultimatum to Israel, threatening sanctions if they don't increase the aid flow. But their track record isn't exactly spotless. If you look back, they haven't always followed through on their demands.
Exactly. The Guardian pointed out that sometimes the U.S. has ignored reports from its own agencies that were saying Israel was blocking aid. So it makes you wonder, is this ultimatum any different? Are they serious about holding Israel accountable this time, or is it all just for show?
It's a tough one to figure out. What we do know for sure is that the people in Gaza are the ones caught in the crossfire. They're the ones suffering, and it's just not right.
It's a situation that demands attention. The international community can't just stand by and watch this happen. They have a responsibility to do everything they can to get aid to the people who desperately need it. And ultimately, they need to find a real solution, one that addresses the root causes of all this suffering in Gaza.
Speaking of things that could shift the global landscape, let's talk about Trump being back in the White House. Specifically, some of the people he's chosen for his cabinet, let's just say they've raised a few eyebrows.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag for sure. And some of these picks could have a major impact, not just on U.S. policy, but on the whole world, really. Like his choice for border czar, Tom Homan. This guy is known for being super strict on immigration.
And Trump's already made it clear that his top priority is launching the biggest deportation operation in U.S. history, and Homan's the guy he's put in charge of it. He's even said something like he's ready to run the biggest deportation operation this country's ever seen.
Considering what happened during Trump's first term when Homan was heading up ICE, a lot of people are pretty worried. Remember all the controversy over the zero tolerance policy that ended up separating families at the border?
Yeah, to be interested to see how this all plays out. It could have huge implications for immigration policy in the U.S. and the lives of so many people and families.
And then there's Stephen Miller, another one who's tough on immigration. He's been appointed Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, which is a pretty influential position. He was basically the architect of a lot of those controversial immigration policies back during Trump's first term.
Yeah, Miller's always been about reducing legal immigration. He was behind some of the most restrictive measures they put in place during Trump's presidency.
Yeah.
So having him back in a position of power like this, it's making people think we're going to see a return to those policies, which would have a big impact on immigration and, the whole demographic makeup of the U.S.
Moving on to the Environmental Protection Agency, Trump's picked former New York rep Lee Zeldin to lead it. The thing is, Zeldin doesn't really have a background in environmental issues, which is kind of interesting.
It's definitely his lack of experience in environmental policy that's got people concerned, especially environmental groups. They're worried that this pick means Trump isn't really committed to fighting climate change or protecting the environment. Especially when you think about what Trump was saying during his campaign, all that stuff about expanding oil drilling and criticizing electric cars.
It's like we're going back to that drill, baby, drill mentality. Although, to be fair, Zeldin did say during his confirmation hearing that he's committed to maintaining high environmental standards, clean air, clean water, all that. So we'll have to wait and see if his actions match his words.
Another interesting pick, Elise Stefanik. She's a New York representative and one of Trump's biggest supporters, and she's been tapped to be the UN ambassador. She really came into the spotlight during Trump's first impeachment trial. She was a fierce defender of his.
Yeah, and her appointment's a big deal because she's been such a strong advocate for Trump's America First foreign policy. So this could mean a pretty big shift in U.S. foreign policy, a more nationalist approach, maybe a more aggressive stance on the world stage.
Her views on Israel are definitely something to watch. She's been really critical of the UN, saying they're biased against Israel. So her being the UN ambassador could mean the U.S. is going to be even more supportive of Israel in international settings.
And that could have consequences for the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, as well as how the U.S. interacts with other countries in the Middle East.
For National Security Advisor, Trump's gone with Mike Waltz. He's a retired Army National Guard officer, a war veteran, and a Republican congressman from Florida. He's got a reputation for being hawkish, especially when it comes to China.
Putting Waltz in such a key position probably means we're going to see the Trump administration continue to take a hard line against China. Waltz has a military background and a lot of experience with national security, so it seems like they're leaning towards a more military-focused approach to foreign policy, which could lead to even more tension with China.
He's also been a big supporter of the U.S. staying involved in Afghanistan, and he's been pushing for a strong military presence in the Middle East. So, with all the conflicts going on over there, especially the war between Israel and Hamas, this appointment could mean the U.S. is more willing to use military force to get what it wants in the region.
And that's worrying, because it could easily escalate things and make that whole region even more unstable. These cabinet appointments, they're not just names on a piece of paper. They have the potential to reshape everything from immigration to how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on them to see how their decisions influence what the Trump administration does in the coming months and years.
Now let's get back to that AP News article about the human costs of all these events. We were talking about how the war is affecting children in Lebanon, and the article really goes into detail about the trauma they're going through.
It's rough, These kids aren't just scared because they're living in a war zone. They're dealing with the psychological effects of seeing all this violence, losing their homes, being forced to flee. Those kinds of scars can stick with you long after the fighting stops.
The article talks about these organizations, Doctors Without Borders and the International Medical Corps. They're doing really important work, providing mental health support to these children. They're setting up activities in the shelters, offering counseling, trying to create some kind of routine and stability for them amidst all the chaos.
But one of the experts they interviewed said something that really stuck with me. They said, it is a generational trauma. They're worried about what this is going to do to these kids in the long run, how these experiences might shape their entire lives.
It's a heavy thought.
Yeah.
You've got these kids, and they're carrying the burden of this whole conflict. The scars they have, the ones you can see and the ones you can't, it's a constant reminder of how destructive war is, how much it hurts people.
It's easy to lose sight of that when you're looking at the big picture, the politics, the military strategies. But we can't forget that every statistic, every decision that's made, it has a real impact on people's lives. And right now, it's the children who are paying the biggest price.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, all the bad stuff happening in the world. But even amidst all the chaos and the terrible things, you still find these incredible stories of people who are resilient, people who find hope. Like in that AP article, the story about that little boy, Hussein McDad, the one who lost his whole family in the Beirut airstrike.
I know his story is just heartbreaking, but there's something so powerful about it too, like He's just a little kid, and he went through something no one should ever have to go through. But he's still here. He's still fighting to survive.
Exactly. The article talks about him playing with toys in the hospital, how he clings to his dad, how he finds these little moments of joy, even in the simplest things. It just shows you that even when you're surrounded by so much pain, the human spirit can still find a way to endure. There's always hope, always a chance for things to get better.
Yeah, and Hussein's story, it's not the only one. The article talks about how so many kids in Lebanon are dealing with the trauma of this war, but they're also finding ways to cope. They're going to school in these shelters, they're doing activities, they're connecting with each other, trying to get back to some kind of normalcy. It's really amazing to see how resilient kids are, how adaptable they are.
They're a real inspiration. It's like they're showing us that even when things seem impossible, there's always hope, always a reason to keep pushing for a better world.
You're right. It's easy to feel powerless when you see all these big problems like wars and geopolitical tensions and natural disasters. But we're not powerless. We all have a part to play in making the world a better place, a fairer place, a more sustainable place.
Totally. Whether it's speaking out for change, supporting organizations that are helping people, raising awareness, or even just having these kinds of conversations about what's going on, all those things matter. Our actions, even the small ones, they add up. They can make a difference.
It all starts with staying informed, staying engaged, not looking away from the problems. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and working together to create a future where peace, justice, and well-being are real for everyone, not just a dream.
I think this deep dive has taken us through a lot, some really heavy and complicated stuff. But I hope you come away from it feeling like even when things are dark, there's still hope out there. People are doing amazing things to make a difference. And there are these incredible stories of resilience that can inspire us all.
So stay curious, stay informed, stay engaged. And until next time, keep diving deep.
If you enjoy our daily news podcast and want to stay updated, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell for notifications. Your support really helps us bring you the latest news every day. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.